Hey, what's going on, everybody? So I wanted to start my first episode of Tujo's Story Hour. Basically, it will entail me reading off of a sheet of paper, and by paper I mean a Word document, but it's basically supposed to come off as a sort of improv piece without it actually being an improv piece. Because let's be honest, I'm pretty rambly at the best of times, and if I was supposed to come with all of this up on the fly, it would not nearly come off as well as it might from a sort of organized or semi-organized format in a Word document. So I'm going to start reading off this piece of paper, and again, I hope this can be a coming series for my YouTube channel. But here goes nothing. So this may or may not come as a surprise to you all, but there was a time I was really into role playing. Now, wait a minute. Hold on. Hold on. I know what you're thinking. Role what? Call me the police. Anytime someone mentions roleplay, it's usually in a sexual context, but that's not what it was like for me. At least, not until much, much later. Roleplaying in the early days kind of set the stage for my interest in improving my abilities as a writer in the descriptive sense, being able to set the scene for what unfolded and the actions by which characters would take as the story would thrive and grow. It sort of set the groundwork for my sense of spelling and grammar. It created the framework that would feed into my imagination. I'll tell you all how it started for me. So when I was younger, I had something of a sheltered childhood. I wasn't taken in by game consoles or computers yet, growing up in the 90s, and my diet was kind of regulated. I didn't even get to drink Coca-Cola unless it was Christmas Eve, and that was like once a year. Hard to believe, I know, but my parents sort of raised me on a semi-regulated basis, semi-not regulated basis. I played outside a lot and had a lot of freedom to go wherever I wanted to go around the neighborhood, like the forest and around the neighborhood and back. And yeah, I'll comment on that in another video. What I'm getting at is, I had some freedoms and I didn't have some freedoms. Anyway, so the first computer I got was this ancient construct with a terrible operating system. I wasn't very impressed. My father didn't play around with it that much. The games on it could just barely be classified as games, and were more educational in nature than fun. Getting a personal computer was pretty groundbreaking, though, and it was pretty awesome just having one. But the first one was just kind of a novelty, more than anything that was actually practical or immersive. So that kind of sucked. But later on, I got a computer that could actually do stuff, let alone connect to the internet. Dial up was still a thing at the time, and it was interesting hearing the dial up noises go around through the phone line just to get a connection. I forget which operating system was on there, but I think it was Windows 98 or something like that. Either way, it was powerful enough to play some game, play something that would constitute as a game. So occasionally I'd go over to a friend's place, and he'd have this really old looking game that basically looked like Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, but in PC format. And basically, whoever made it ripped the sprites, models, and level design and made it some sort of MMORPG that was old school in design, but basically catered to a bunch of tweens at the time. The game's name was Graal, and it was something of a fascination for me as time went on. Graal's interface was kind of a revamped version of Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. It was basically a social medium of sorts into a game, with admins able to affect level design and employ a variety of different in-game programs to make events or games. And for a while, for me, it was just mindless hack and slash running around being a dummy exploring hard to navigate levels. But, and I don't know how it happened, but one day I discovered a server called Valikorlia. See, each server was its own standalone entity, with Old Graal being the original server from which Graal originated, Arrow basically being a Grand Theft Auto clone with a very urbanized environment and street gang veneer, and I spent most of my time on Babylon. Babylon was pretty nondescript, but I ran with a guild called the Jate Cult. They had magic, they utilized said magic in battle. Fun times. I was good friends with the guild leader, even though I was a total newbie. Eye of the Beholder, who sort of looked after me. But yeah, things kind of went bad with the cult leader when I kind of lashed out at the guild members for abandoning the cult, then coming back and expecting things to just go back to the way they used to be. So things kind of tapered off from there. It just wasn't the same after that. So yeah, the guild was a shadow of its former self, and I just kind of meandered until a friend of mine contacted me one day. He found a place called Valikorlia and invited me over to enjoy the peace of the action. So I made the jump, and it was nothing I'd ever expected before up to that moment. Valikorlia introduced me to role-playing firsthand. Valikorlia, as a server, was a pretty nondescript medieval fantasy-esque setting in which several different kingdoms existed on one overworld map, each drastically different from one another, and catering to different people to quote-unquote reside there. You had Valikorlia itself, which was pretty much just medieval England meets the Alliance and WoW. You had Arcadia, which was something like out of World of Warcraft with its steampunk flair and having weird gadgetry and flying machines and things like that. You had Imperia, which was pretty much just a city sitting on the ocean with big ships and naval battles and things like that. Then you had Frost, which, as its name would suggest, was basically a kingdom on a giant ice cube in the middle of the ocean, far, far away. You had Aska Dagner, which catered to the elves, and was hit by a meteorite, if I'm not mistaken, much later in its history. You had Lehan, later renamed Lurhin, which was the desert nation out in the middle of nowhere. There was an underground nation catering to the Dro called Sundasa or something like that, and basically the Dro would set out to kill or kidnap people. There was even a borderline fascist, like World War I inspired nation called, I actually can't think of the name right now. Started with an A, kind of like Arcadia, but Alcaria? I think it was Alcaria. Basically, everybody there was made fun of for the fact that they wore these dumb-looking pickle hobs and acted like they were tough shit because they were disciplined and had something resembling a World War I army in the Middle Ages, no less. Oh well, it was interesting, I guess. There was Suriku, which is basically an entire nation of feudal Japan sitting on the back of a giant turtle that swam around the ocean. A lot of Japanese cultural references mixed with Asiatic ones, like from China and Korea, but to a far much lesser degree. As far as random places go, you had Terran, you had Labu, you had Solia, and some other places that I can't immediately recall. So Labu was basically just a wilderness up there where a temperate forest met a mountain range where random shit would happen because it was a convenient meeting place for adventurers and orcs to show up. Since the orcs pretty much claimed a section of the territory, they were there intermittently, with a fairy pond at the heart of its wilds. There was also this township on its own called Terran, and I don't know what kind of people lived in Terran, but Terran itself, for its existence and being at crossroads, was constantly being attacked and raided by people. I remember 2 separate occasions where I was there and was being raided, whether by orcs or by the undead. Terran, I think, was an unincorporated township that was supposed to be under the protection of Valikorlia, but had independence as a sort of separate township. So it was kind of on its own for the most part. But yeah, Solia was just some port town, kind of like the port town in Oblivion that was off on its own. While some things happened there, it wasn't nearly as active as Labu or Terran, but I do remember some random shit unfolding before my very eyes when you hung out there for just long enough. I remember the Crossroads Inn, which, as the name implies, sat smack dab in the middle of the map. It was a pretty decent place to hang out if you really wanted to. But yeah, I spent a lot of time as a kid on Valikorlia, and got to see its transition from a booming world of activity into a mere shadow of its former glory. The beginning days were rough. I was just some no-name noob, with some big ideas and high aspirations, but wasn't seasoned enough to really convey myself in the way that I wanted to. And it was pretty early on that I remember meeting up with this wolf guy named Maku, and this other fox guy named Ken or something, and we all palled around and traveled the world together, making cheap commentary and screwing around. We sat on our own, we set up our own personal stories that involved random people that happened to engage with us. Me? I was basically just some kitsune swordsman who was adapting to his European-esque feudal surroundings and wanting to be a knight, adorning plate armor and facing off against all manner of dangers in an entirely uncertain world. So, random stuff happened. I remember making several different characters and joining up with the Silverglade, an order of knights devoted to honor and justice. I remember setting up a couple of characters, like a swordsman who joined up with Imperia as a captain, reaching the rank of admiral before unceremoniously being killed against the battle against Dro. I had a Ronin character who was inspired roughly by Roni Kenshin, but he didn't accomplish anything significant. There was a brother of the admiral who went on to survive the end of the world, but we'll get to that later. I had a character who rose through the ranks fairly quickly of Valikorlia, and in the second incarnation of the game, my primary character lived long enough to be Grand Master of a knightly order of Neo Valikorlia before succumbing to his wounds against a dragon. Now, you could have multiple characters be part of any nation you want to be a part of, so long as that they would take you in, you could prove yourself worthy of the station you were assigned through skill and understanding, you showed interest in that nation. Now, Valikorlia was more of about the story and player interaction than it was about the gameplay itself. as there were some pretty weird and obscure overworld enemies that you can engage with, but not many. It was all done through role playing and contingent on the sense of based on your character's abilities against whatever struggles you happen to be facing at the time. Kind of like a D&D light, but your character abilities and items were contingent on admin approval based on how well you could convince them about, the interest to a unique character, that the ability in question were balanced or could be negated and thusly fair, and moderated engagements between players. Now, obviously, some people had very inflated egos as to the abilities of their characters, and being attached, they would try to kill others without opening themselves up or consenting to their character being killed or hurt. So, there was an imbalance in that regard, but it was sort of this imbalance that kept things interesting. Even though people abused their special abilities and pushed the envelope on what would be considered good, or not conducive to roleplay development. For those that would not listen to sense of reason, we called them power role players. For those that could seemingly sense things that their character would not otherwise be privy to said information or be aware of, we called that metagaming. Power roleplay was fiercely frowned upon, but it happened. And there wasn't really much you can do about that besides call the guy a fucker and unfair. And the admins, or should I say, badmins, in some cases, would just shrug their shoulders. Now bear in mind, there were two Valikorlias that I was familiar with. Old Valikorlia and New Valikorlia. And Old Valikorlia was in the administration of Jesse, who was a furry, and had a kitsune character, if I remember correctly, and there was a lot of animosity towards furries at the time. And Jesse's popularity as a moderator was always put into question, namely by this one jackass by the name of Clash. Clash acted like he was hot shit because he had level design and make pixel art that was very conducive to the development of Valikorlia's visuals, and turned the political atmosphere of Valikorlia into a popularity contest. Hence began his bid to become owner of Valikorlia, and see to it as he saw fit. Jesse received a lot of hatred from left and right, and growing discontent with what was regarded as stagnant leadership. Ironically, it was during this time of so-called stagnant leadership that I had my fondest memories of Valikorlia, simply because what came afterwards was a very long, slow, and painful decline of what had been a decent platform to enjoy roleplay. One of his few detractors was smart enough to recognize this at the time, and saying, "Captain Clash, he's a hero, going to drive the player count straight to 0. Jesse eventually had enough and relinquished control of the server to Clash. He'd been done being abused. And I can't say that I blame the guy, because people were outright just laying the hate right in front of his face. Like, I hadn't seen hate like this since I watched Darkside Phil at YouTube's at a Street Fighter tournament. All he wanted was to enjoy the server and see to its continued success. But Clash, he had other ideas. He wanted to call the shots. He wanted to start another post-apocalyptic event and force the server to start over, and so began the 9 apocalypses. Also, very blatant nepotism and cronyism as far as his leadership structure went, but we'll get into that later. Valikorlia had already suffered 2 post-apocalyptic events known as the Abyssal Wars, only one of which I was a part of, the other being far earlier in its history as a game. So, what began was the relative calm before the storm. A demon that looked like a massive samurai armor with an evil eye in its middle of its belly began burning massive amounts of the map. Just like spontaneously appeared one day as some major threat to the world. No real explanation as to why, but Clash thought it'd be hella cool, so boy almighty, he got his demon. In fact, I was there when it showed up and started destroying this place in Port Solia, just me and my friend. As players tried to devise novel ways of felling the demonic entity, from diamond-tipped arrows infused with holy water to various blessed weaponry and magic, well, nothing could really stem the tide of what was to come. Clash brought a flood, a great flood, to cover the entire world. Now, I think the demon was instrumental in breaking the ties with the gods, the mana stream, and the world, which caused a flood for some reason. Again, so much was happening at the same time. I was more worried about all this impacting my individual characters on the individual level. So a lot of the lore kind of escaped me, but yeah, massive floods started and the whole world was flooded over because people took their ships to drift in the seas as the floodwaters came down. Now, there was the tippy top of Labu, and there was this massive island before people, like a period of time passed when everybody was confined to boats. Labu saw fierce interfactional warfare between a growing number of so-called nihilists who had lost faith in the gods over what happened, and were very violently and aggressively attacking those that had still had faith to consolidate power over Labu. Now, as far as the island saw some similar factional conflicts, though this was more between the survivors of the nations and disagreements on how resources was going to be doled out, and other logistical concerns, as all acclimated to their new surroundings. There came basically a final scene where a 30-year time span passed between the events of the flood and that of a restoration of the world, though it was very, very vague, and how it was not only described and how things were playing out. Like, I remember this very moving scene, but I think it was implied that all the people on the island were supposed to die, quote unquote, and pass on some transcendence before the world restored itself. So I don't know. It was arbitrary and attempting to be deep and philosophical at the same time, but really honestly caused more confusion to me than anything else. Anyway, New Valikorlia was established shortly thereafter. A good many people kept their old characters, or a substantial number of them did, but plenty of newbies were still interested in the game at the time, so they started over. Now, New Valikorlia arose from the ashes, but a vast majority of the old Valikorlia nations that weren't of Valikorlia itself were actually wiped clean from existence. Imperia, Arcadia, etc. I remember that there were a few events when remnants of said nations arose, only for Valikorlia to dispatch swordmen and soldiers to try to round them up and rout them, not only because they didn't want to be opposed in the new world by remnants of the past. A central location had opened up and established itself as a sort of town called Bridgeton, which was established as twin rows and a multitude of tangent buildings on the water built around what was quite literally a bridge, hence Bridgeton. It was also sort of a quasi-intermediary 1600s-style place where the men and fighters were armed with rifles. When the head of it rose to leadership status as opposed to a governor or mayor, I even had a character who was knighted in defense of the place. Now, there was Ethras, the official new capital of Valikorlia. There was Staghorn, colloquially referred to as Faghorn due to the unpopularity of the people that were a part of Staghorn. Labu came back, for the most part, in the same form that it had been before, but without that weird connection to Zundasa and some other parts that were considered lost in the transition from old Valikorlia to new Valikorlia. But yeah, New Valikorlia was weird. I kind of liked the sense of desolation and despair that the events leading up to this moment had, in which we had all survived like 2 apocalypses in one. But yeah, after all of that nonsense to the present, a lot of the player count had gone down. Like, we had been seeing numbers as high as 180 to 200 before, but following the collapse, we were lucky to break 100. And the numbers steadily went down from there as more and more people grew dissatisfied with how Valikorlia was run. Ken and Maku left for greener pastures on the other Graal sites, and I kind of lost contact with them. To this date, I actually don't know what struggles or trials they had faced elsewhere, but they would not participate with Valikorlia for the rest of their time here. I sometimes think I should have listened to them, saved myself a lot of aggravation in taking their advice and leaving with them, but I didn't. Because if I did, I probably wouldn't be telling this story right now, would I? So for the most part, there was a real sense of intrigue in what remained. But as time went on, the events grew more and more one-sided to cater to the more vocal and titled pieces of shit that basked in the spotlight and enjoyed relative popularity, I guess. It seemed more like a few people genuinely liked them, and most people just tolerated them because they didn't care to be on their bad side. Let's see if I can come up with a tally of these agitators, shall we? There was a dickhead named Levowitz, who I had known from old Valikorlia because he had always played as this dumb, violent orc. Levowitz was infamous for his aggressive stance on anyone he didn't like, which included furries, which, by extension, included me. He openly rallied against me nonstop over mass messages in his crusade against fur fags, quote-unquote, which would otherwise be kind of funny if it wasn't so annoying at the time. He was a power role player, and basically a fucking asshole when it came down to it. But yeah, he was slick, and he could really just schmooze himself into a seat of power, and became a quote-unquote badman for Clash. But yeah, he abused his power on occasion, He used his power as an admin to coax people into doing things that were disadvantageous for them to his benefit, and openly utilized intimidation tactics to bully people into doing things. He was kind of like Biff from Back to the Future series, but a little bit smarter, and I say a little bit smarter, and wholly lacking in morals or principle. He was relevant only in his attempts to mold the server to his whim, and being the center of attention at all times, trying to make all of his so thought out characters, when he grew tired of them, to die as martyrs. There was this asshole named DX who hated furries, was an even greater passion than Levo, and would unceremoniously denigrate me every chance he got, and look down his nose at me, both out of character and in character, just because I was a furry. He was a draconian, as far as his star character goes, was involved in one event where he suffered no repercussions in spite of being aligned with dragons and nearly destroying the new Valikorlia. Also did a lot of overpowered bullshit because he was Muppet Dragon. And that's pretty much all I can remember of that asshole. There was Edgar, a dumb kid who got away with pretty much anything just because he didn't know better, and because some of the admins felt sorry for him. And he let this get to his head. Also hated furries. For quite literally no reason other than the fact that it was all the cool kids were doing at the time, and he wanted a piece of the action. He did a lot of stupid shit that you just ask, why? Like, I remember one of his abilities was basically being able to conjure, like, hundreds upon hundreds of paper, and the paper would mold around itself to become like a weapon. But aside from giving you a paper cut, I don't know what the weapon was actually supposed to do. But yeah, he had admin protection in some cases and was allowed to be our village idiot. So he got to do whatever, you know? Anyway, most of the girls I didn't have a problem with in the slightest. But there was this one quote-unquote woman named Misa who got special protections under Clash's leadership because Clash needed to get his dick wet. And you know how that goes. Though, with the ardent third-wave feminism bullshit she seemed to stand for and the blatant man-hating that went kind of beyond normal, I began to suspect that Misa wasn't actually a woman, but really a self-hating man. And also because of all the drama-mongering piece of shit and stuff goes, you know, got half the server to hate me because I dared question her actions during an event, to which she power role-played, metagamed, and got away with dangerous situations scot-free when she was playing a disposable character that was only bound by the local government. Oh, I meant bounty by the local government. Anyway, she painted it as two miscreants, me and a friend, going after her at random because we didn't like the outcome. We didn't get the outcome that we wanted. I don't know. If I mentioned this before, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but basically her character was an overpowered orc that took an arrow to the chest, pulled it out without effort, and unceremoniously went, ow, before going back to what they were doing. Caused the fire to just burn down the entire forest of Labu and attempt to kill everybody that showed up for the event itself. Anyway, apart from that sense of brief negativity, things didn't quite develop as you'd expect. It just seemed less and less like epic storytelling of yesterday and more of the same old shit of today. There came a point in Valikorlia's history where the admins tried various gimmicks to simulate roleplay activity, like a point system where if you were witnessed doing something out of your comfort zone or being instrumental to roleplaying, you got points awarded. The points could either be traded in for unique approvals or events on your request, which was kind of an interesting idea, but at the same time was largely unnecessary. Why couldn't things go back to the way they used to be? The point system was eventually done away with because of how broken it was and because admins would sometimes give people some points but not others because of nepotism and discriminatory practices. Anyway, I remember getting a rudimentary gas mask approved because a character experienced a gas attack, but a hypocritical asshole by the name of Wind made it so that a personal point to get it unapproved because he perceived it as a check and balance against Levowitz's tear gas abilities. I explained that the entire reason my character conceptualized and came up with the tear gas was because he had been a recipient of a tear gas attack, but Wind, with his infinite wisdom, being the pig-headed, stubborn dickhead that he was, would not budge. A lot of admins asked me not to cause a rift between adminship, but that they would begrudgingly approve the device if I really wanted them to, but that it would threaten the cohesion between admins. Given how dogmatic and dickish Wind was, in all of his dealings with me, I went for it. Wind, of course, not to be outdone by other admins, assigned a number of arbitrary penalties to it because he was an asshole that would not be crossed no matter what. So whatever. The days of being given fair approvals were over, and so my interest was quickly waning. Now, this is done on a forum site, which is set up to make an official record of approvals, developments, events, and characters that were in play, which made a great deal of sense. However, many of the problems that had begun during the change of an era followed through to this new incarnation of Valikorlia. By this point, I had accomplished a great deal as an individual. I had been the Grand Master of a nation, Valikorlia, and was a dutiful knight. I had another Grand Master knight that had risen through the ranks. I had another knight that was head of a small but elite group of knights by the name of the Legion of Steel. I had several characters that had accomplished a great deal, but with so much pushback by admins and assholes alike, I was reminded of how futile everything was becoming. You see, ever since Clash became owner of the site, his administration, if you can call it that, was riddled with corruption, nepotism, and arbitrary action. Player count began to dwindle, and by the time I was getting ready to leave for good, I remember the player count being lucky to break 30, if that. A lot of things happened in New Valikorlia. Some things that come to mind: magic came back, and so did the powerful Omnipotent Mages Guild that was being attacked by non-magi for perceived transgressions, real or imagined. Dragons had briefly, in the early days, tried to consecrate control over the entire continent in a bit of total annihilation, but were soundly defeated, I being a part of that one. I became involved with Lurhin as a commander, the Desert Kingdom, later becoming part of Valikorlia due to financial constraints and other developments. Bridgeton had long since fell due to attack by the undead. There were plague outbreaks, there were incursions, there were foreign attacks. Various lich and other undead creatures were attacking the living in an increasing frequency. However, like I said, a lot of counterintuitive, redundant features were introduced. Like, there was an ability set up where basically you could set up a cardboard cutout equivalent of your character as a stand-in. So, idling became the new national pastime. People would log onto an idle, create elaborate scenes with those cardboard cutouts, and then idle until either their friends showed up or people that were deemed cool enough to roleplay actually showed up. I remember shortly before I left, that kind of stuck with me, because there was this guy that approached me and said directly that, in spite of all the unwarranted punishment that I had been dealt with from assholes and from badmins, that I dared remain on Valikorlia and persevered against all odds. That I stuck by all this time, that I was an inspiration to him for carrying on this long and trying my best to persevere as an honorable and dutiful character. I didn't think about it until I decided to quit the server for good. And that was many years ago. I just kind of dropped it cold turkey. One day turned two turned to a week turned to a month turned to a year, and then it was years until now that I just looked back on it all. People asked me to come back, but I refused. Negative reception I had received and developed about the server was enough to make me not want to give a shit. And I decided to go to DeviantArt and take on text-based role-playing, which was made for a far better quality role-playing experience with far better role-playing characters and partners than I had seen on Valikorlia. That brought with it a whole slew of other benefits but consequences, but I'll get on to that another time. Maybe. Looking back, I can't help but feel as though there could have been a better way to avail myself to constructive roleplay, but hey, it did start the saga into my other role-playing experiences, and so I moved on to DeviantArt until it all went to shit as well, and the ensuing roleplays I had up to that point. But that'll be for later. So yeah, I revealed to you all how I used to be able to roleplay, and that's how it sort of got me into writing my own stories and working on my own books, trying to bring things together. Now, after reading all this, some things that came to mind. You remember how I mentioned Misa, right? Misa, in that intermediary period between when old Valikorlia and new Valikorlia was kind of developing, she tried an event called Turtle Junction. And Turtle Junction was all about a Japanese-y sort of like easternly city on a series of like palisades in the middle of nowhere basically facing some sort of incursion from within. I think it was basically like the Meiji Restoration, where gunpowder had just been a thing, and well, gunpowder's been a thing in Japan for a while, but I'm talking about like it became a sort of challenge between old and new technologies. Um, but yeah, it almost seemed like we were going to lose Valikorlia as we knew it forever because it was alluded to that basically the server was going to keep resetting. That every new successive incarnation of Valikorlia was going to be something completely different. Like after Turtle Junction, they were going to try doing something in the Wild Wild West. You know, like think for a few dollars more, but with Clint Eastwood and stuff like that. Obviously, Clint Eastwood played the man with no name, but it'd be like a few dollars more, but with all cowboys and stuff. And that seems so disastrous to me that you're just going to keep wiping the server clean whenever you perceive people getting bored with things. People were getting bored with things because they didn't have a reason to lay faith in the server, you know? What's the point if there's going to be another end of the world event coming up, you know? What emotional attachment do I have to my characters or what happens if everything's just going to go wiped clean again, you know? Now, obviously, you can make the argument, Tujo, this is all about the experience. It's all about the experience. But I would turn to you and basically look you in the eye and say, it's the principle of the matter. I had a sense of connection to the characters I had, but, you know, my characters will live on in art. As for Valikorlia, I never said goodbye officially, and I'm sure most of the people on Valikorlia would just be like, bye, Felicia. But I guess I can say an official goodbye is in order. So, goodbye. I don't miss you. Anyway, so much for that. Nostalgia's a bitch, wouldn't you say? Anyway, I'm going to move on. I'm going to try another story. I think for our first episode, this was okay. My voice isn't quite what it should be due to sinuses, but again, I'll work on that. Maybe I just need to, like, drink some lemon juice. Maybe put some hot water on my face. I don't know. But yeah. I will work on some other stories. I have a ton of stories that I'm willing to share with you all. I hope you find this, you know, relatively entertaining. I might come back later and try to refine this story because obviously one time, this all started one day, basically. I started writing random thoughts about my experiences on Graal and Valikorlia, and it turned into, how many pages is this? According to this is 8 pages worth of documents. So, you know, not too shabby, but again, I could have done much better. I could have gone into much more deeper expository detail with things, but maybe for next time. For now, I hope that you don't mind this brief illusion. As things come to mind, I'll be able to make a better, clearer picture for you all. But hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you later, guys. I'm going to work on some other stuff right now. Take care.